Today I have with me Jennifer Noonan to talk about, a couple of different things. But I guess before we get into exactly what we're going to talk about, Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. If you could start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, just kind of what you're doing right now? You're teaching Hebrew Bible, but
hmm
where are you teaching? And then also, I'm curious, where did you get your education from?
Sure. Well, let me start with the second question. I got my undergrad at Malone University in Canton, Ohio, master's in church music and in Old Testament at Ashland Theological Seminary, and then PhD at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which is where I met my husband, who's also a PhD from HUC, and
Wow.
did research on second language acquisition and how that can help us learn the biblical languages better.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so both you and your husband are Bible teachers.
That's right.
That's
That's right.
crazy. Wow. Okay. Is that for a fun dynamic?
It is. We work well together. We're always reading each other's stuff and saying, "What do you think about this?" And so it's a fun dynamic for that.
Yeah. That's super cool. Okay. So, and then right now you're teaching where?
We're at Columbia International University at Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay.
Um, so teaching there, and I've done a little bit of work for Liberty University online
Okay.
as
And so
well.
what classes, at least this year, what classes are you teaching?
This year, I've had the Book of Jeremiah, the Minor Prophets, and Hebrew 4.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
Okay. And so when you did your PhD at Hebrew Union College, what
mhm.
was your dissertation on? What'd you spend all those years talking about?
I did an actual study with Hebrew students and did a pre-test, post-test experimental design where one group got traditional instruction for a week, one group got an experimental instruction for about a week, and then compared any gains from pre-test to post-test and how that affected the way they learned that particular unit. It was the call perfect in Hebrew.
Yeah. Okay. And you just, I think recently, a couple years ago, right, released a book which is titled A Handbook of Second Language Acquisition for Biblical Studies.
That's right.
What's that all about?
So that's distilling kind of the big ideas that have developed out of second language acquisition research that's been done for modern languages, but it would be applicable as well to the biblical languages, and kind of giving biblical scholars, those who teach Hebrew, Greek, Latin, an intro overview of what the field of SLA is about and how it might apply to teaching biblical languages.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool. Well, I'm really excited then just to jump right in if you're ready for it to what we are going to be talking about today, which is mostly just trying to dig deep under why knowing Hebrew, because you're clearly very passionate about the language and then about
Right.
teaching people the language, but why is it so important for people to engage the Bible? Not just in their original language or in their own current language, but also engage it from the biblical author's language. Maybe in this circumstance,
Mhm.
that's in the Hebrew Bible. We're talking about Hebrew, maybe even a
Right.
little bit of Aramaic if you have, or like, isn't there? There's a portion right in the prophets.
That's
It's
right.
done in Aramaic as well, and
That's right.
so yeah, why is that helpful? Is what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to start off too, just with like a little story from my own experience as of recently, where this became very obvious of the fact that like when I only read the Bible in English for myself, I'm missing things that the biblical authors were trying to communicate to their original recipients.
hmm
And like the other day, I was reading Genesis. What is it, like Genesis 3? Yeah, the original fall narrative. It talks about how Eve sees that the fruit is beautiful, and then she takes it. And there's like that phrase that she sees and she takes. And then when you get to Genesis 6, there's that exact same repetition, where it says the sons of God or the Benin Elohim, right? That they see, that the daughters of humans are good or beautiful, and then they take for themselves. But in the translation that I was reading in, which was the NIV, I did not catch it at all at first, because it reads, the way that they translated it is, it says that the sons of God, they married any one of them that they chose. And then I went and looked. Yeah, and I went and looked in a linear, and I saw that the literal translation, I guess in the Hebrew, would be that they took for themselves wives. So the repetition is seen there, that these sons of God, these spiritual beings, they see the daughters and then they take this in the same way that Eve sees the fruit and takes. And just that for me was one of those realizations where it's like, I am going to miss this if I don't engage the text on its own terms and its own language. So just an example from my own experience, but I wanted then to allow that to be a segue into you kind of explaining to us, what are some other ways that maybe this occurs through the Hebrew Bible? And can you just help us see some of that?
Sure. And I think I'd like to start my explanation by kind of coming against a common assumption, especially for people who aren't doing a lot of Bible translating themselves. This idea that you can just take an English word, swap the Hebrew out, and bam, you've got a translation. And there's just rarely this one-to-one correspondence when translating from Hebrew into English. And beyond that, even some simple, we think should be basic words, carry cultural baggage that just really doesn't come through easily in English. So just as a simple example, if you think about the word bayit in Hebrew, which means house in English, and most translations will just swap out house for bayit when they do the translation, but it carries all this baggage. I mean, for you, think about it. If I were to ask you to draw a house, you would probably come up with this rectangular, 2-story, 4 windows with glass, pointed roof, and that would be the house. But if I were to ask an ancient Israelite the same thing, they would have a very different picture. I mean, it would be stone or maybe mud brick. It would have a flat roof. There would be windows, but no glass. I mean, it's just a very different concept, even though the words will swap out if you want to do the translation for it. And then if we broaden it even further and talk about the semantic range of each, in other words, the meanings that these words could convey, in English, house, we might think a little bit broader into like houses of Congress, or the idiom a house of cards or something like that, which the Hebrew-speaking people would not connect with at all. But their semantic range would include things like temple or palace or dynasty, or the phrase the Beit Av, that is the house of the father, which is the family unit, a large family unit living together with 3 or 4 generations and their unmarried daughters and servants and animals. And, so all of this, it's carrying baggage that we aren't catching in English. And that's just a simple example. Another one that's more complex are an example of a word that is in Hebrew that we just don't even have an English word for. And it's really difficult to bring into English. And so an example of this would be the Hebrew word chesed. It's just really hard to translate. And different translations are going to bring it into English differently. We get like loving kindness or steadfast love, sometimes mercy, sometimes loyalty. But it's a really important, theologically, an important word. And so it's important that we get it into English, but we just don't have a word for it in English. And so, it means, and this is like a whole couple sentence, it means treating someone well because that person is a family member, or because you've got an established covenant relationship with them. And so, for example, in Hosea 6:6, it says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Well, the English word mercy there is bringing hesed into out of translation. And it's just not carrying that full baggage that comes with it. When we talk mercy, we usually think of an individual instance where we've had the opportunity to do good or bad, and we decide to do good to that person. Whereas Hesed is like this lifelong commitment, and how God expresses his Hesed to us, but we often don't return it. And so we just lose all that if you don't understand the Hebrew behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that's exactly the type of things that I wanted to talk about, and that's a good first example. I've heard people translate that best, or best in my opinion, as God's covenant loyal love, Hesed. And of course, like you're saying, it's not going to. That's three words, and it's not going to communicate the entire story.
Mm-hmm.
But we're just really trying to do our best out here. It seems like trying to get as close as possible we can. But like you're saying, there's a whole world behind just one simple word for them that brings in so much connotation. Yeah, that's a
Mm-hmm.
really good example. What are some
Mm-hmm.
more things that you have that are similar?
Another one, if you look at Proverbs 22:6, it's a famous proverb: train a child up in the way he should go, and
Mm.
when he's old, he will not turn from it. The problem is it's been mistranslated a lot. The word for train a child up is actually the same word that's used for dedication, like the Feast of Dedication, like Hanukkah. It's
Mm.
Hanak. And so it really means to dedicate or to give over to a special purpose, basically. Some people will cross-reference Genesis 14:14, where Abraham has his trained men, but it's not that they're trained; it's that they're dedicated to that purpose of going and being warriors and going to get Lot out of captivity. So that's one problem with the translation. The other is when it says the way he should go, the Hebrew there is just his ways. And anywhere else in the Bible, that's translated as his way, like his chosen way, what he has
Mm.
chosen to do. And so the result is we don't let the child decide which way he should go. You need to intervene as a parent or guardian. So if you dedicate the child to his ways, if you let him do whatever he wants, basically, then you've got a problem. So it's not the positive as much as the English would lead us to believe. It's more the negative. Don't let them do this because they're going to go in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, what about then? There's certain words as well in the Hebrew Bible that we don't have a translation for at all, or like we don't even know what it means in the the slightest sense. And one that came to my mind was frequently in the Psalms, at the end of a psalm, it'll come up, and I'm probably going to pronounce this so wrong because I don't know anything about Hebrew, but it's Salah, right? Isn't it? There's like oftentimes at the end it's like Salah or
Mm-hmm.
something like that,
Right.
and then basically I think most translators will just like leave it out. They just
Yeah.
won't even translate it because nobody really knows what it means.
Right.
Why does that happen? Why is it
Right.
that way?
Well, part of the problem is in the Hebrew Bible, we only have a slice of the language. We don't have the full range. We don't have like everyday things like go to the store and now I lay me down to sleep, or whatever your normal everyday kind of language. It's very specific to God revealing himself to his people. And so there are things that maybe they only occur once, and we just have no other context. We don't know what they mean outside of there, and we can get an idea based on the context in scripture. But because we only have this limited portion of the Hebrew language, they're just things we've lost, things we don't
Hmm.
know. Um, because outside the Bible, we have a few inscriptions in Hebrew, and of course there are the other Semitic languages surrounding Hebrew that can give us some idea in terms of cognates, and we use all of those if we can, or the Septuagint translation, or various things that might help us. But some we just don't have the information we need.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's keep going because I'm sure you have a few more examples then if you want to share, like just some ways, yeah, more
Mm-hmm.
ways that the Hebrew language can do things that the English can't.
Sure. Another is just in terms of nuance. For example, in Genesis 3, back to the same passage you were looking at, but a different place in that, in Genesis 3:8, the narrator, perhaps Moses, says that after Adam and Eve had sinned, that they hid themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the root there is to hide. It's hava, but it's put in the reflexive stem, the hitpael, that they hid themselves, more of an active kind of sense. But then when Adam tells God what he was doing in verse 10, just a couple verses later, he uses a different stem that's a passive stem that says, I was hid. Like, and it removes the agency. So even there, we're already seeing him
Mm-hmm.
trying to blame shift. It's not that he hid himself the way the narrator says it, but Adam says, I was hid. And it kind of takes the blame off, like, I just showed up and I was hidden.
Yeah.
And that's not it,
Yeah. It wasn't
It's,
me.
right. It's the same root used in both cases, but it uses a different stem in Hebrew that carries a different nuance. And the NIV just says they hid or I hid. For each of it just says hid. It doesn't get the I hid myself or I was hid. It just says hid. And so we lose that nuance that the Hebrew is carrying to show the perspective of Adam in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's another example. Another thing that Hebrew can do that English can't in the same way is it has much more flexible word order. And so if we say the man bit the dog, we have to say it that way, because if we say the dog bit the man, it's a very different meaning. But in
Yeah.
Hebrew, you can flip the word order like that, and whatever comes up front is often what they're trying to emphasize. And so there are places where that gets lost as well in terms of emphasis, where they change the word order to say this word up front is the most important word. And we can't do that in English because it changes the meaning. So there, sometimes it comes through in translation, but other times you just can't do that. So an example that I came up with was from Judges 1:21, where it says, the Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. And the context here in Judges is it's just a place of a list of places that the Israelites had taken or not in their conquest under Joshua. And here, what's fronted, in other words, what's put up front in the sentence, is the Jebusites, whereas the English translation makes it sound like the Benjamites are the ones who are important. The Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites, but instead the focus here is, oh, all these other people got driven out, but the Jebusites, they didn't get driven out by the Benjamites. And so we miss that in the translation, and that they wanted to emphasize that particular word in it.
Yeah. Okay. What about word plays? Because I've also noticed that there's things that in Hebrew, once I look at my interlinear or hear
Mm-hmm.
somebody teach on it, I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's another thing I would never notice. For example,
Yes.
Genesis, now we're in Genesis 2. We'll keep on that early Genesis train. Like there's the phrase that well, Adam, mankind
Mm-hmm.
is made
Mm-hmm.
from the Adamah, which
That's
is
right.
like, so
That's right.
yeah, in English, I guess it would just be that the human or mankind was made from the dust of the ground. And it's like,
Right.
okay, I read that and I move on. But then
Right.
in Hebrew, you're noticing, oh, Adam's made from Adamah, and
That's right.
there's a wordplay there. And you see
Yes.
several things like that, I guess, throughout the
Yes.
entire Hebrew Bible.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. And a few other examples for that. Sometimes it's just a matter of alliteration. So in Psalm
Mhm.
122:6, it's pray for the peace of Jerusalem, may those who love you be secure. Okay, but in Hebrew, listen to this. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim yishla'u ohavaik. You hear
Mm.
all the sh la back and forth, and it's this repeated. It's almost a tongue twister, but they do that intentionally. They love the sound plays for artistry, but then more specifically play on words. If you look at Micah chapter 1, starting in verse 10, it says, tell it not in Gath. It's like, okay, that's great. But in Hebrew, tell sounds like Gath. And they did that intentionally. And there's this whole list from 10 to 15 where Micah calls out all different place names, Gath and Beth Ophrah and Zatnah and all these places. And each place gets an imperative, a command that sounds like the place name or is related in meaning in some way. So it starts with tell it not in Gath, where tell sounds like Gath, but then it goes on and says in Beth Ophrah, roll in the dust. Well, Beth Ophrah means house of dust. So he's saying, in house of dust, roll in the dust.
Yeah.
So it just goes on and on and on. And if you will permit me, James Moffat's paraphrase of this particular passage is great. It's not exactly true to the Hebrew, but it brings into English the word plays in a way that we would understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So just for this section, he says, tell it not in Tellington, wail not in wailing, dust manor will eat dirt, dressy town flee naked, safe fold will not save, Walchester's walls are down, a bitter doe strings Bitterton, toward Jerusalem, city of peace, the Lord sends war, harness the war steeds of men of Barstead, Zion's beginning of sinning equal to Israel's crime, to welfare a last farewell, for trapping trapped Israel's kings.
Oh,
and
wow.
so it's just a really creative English way of
Yeah.
bringing those word plays forward. So
Yeah.
that's what they're doing in Hebrew, but we totally miss it when it says, tell it not in Gath, in Beth Ophrah, roll in the dust.
Mm-hmm.
We lose the fun Hebrew word plays that they're bringing in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt like I was listening to the King James version, but a little more confusing. but you're right. It keeps some of the rhetoric at least. You know, something I've always been curious about, because you mentioned things like alliterations and all of that, but I've always been curious in the Psalms. Does it rhyme? You know, like when we create music today,
Right.
we have all of these different, ways to write songs and to make sure that they rhyme and to make sure that they have the right amount of beats and they have the right amount of syllables and all this different stuff. Are the Psalms similar to that? Where they're, if I just sang it in Hebrew, it would sound kind of, something similar?
That's a great question. They actually don't do it the same way we do in English.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of meter, but even that's kind of debated. There is what they call kina meter, which is a lament meter, and it's kind of this off balance where it's 3 accents in the first half and 2 accents in the second half, almost like this, you're not marching, you're kind of limping along. Otherwise, the meter is just, it's really hard to discern. And the same thing with rhyme, at least end rhyme. In end rhyme in Hebrew, part of the problem is so much of Hebrew already rhymes naturally that to do end rhyme in Hebrew, it's like there's no art in it because everybody does it anyway. It's like in Spanish, everything ends in O or A, and so it all naturally rhymes anyway. So there's no artistry in trying to create end rhymes. So what they do instead is this alliteration, the internal rhyme, the word plays, that kind of a thing.
Okay.
To make it interesting and artistic.
Yeah, that's super unique. Okay, cool. What about this? Okay, this is another thing, because I'm getting to finally ask all my Hebrew questions that I have nobody else to ask them to. I've heard that at the very end of the Hebrew Bible, which Hebrew Bible, it was different than the Christian Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible, the very last book is the Chronicles, right?
That's right.
And so the very last line, from what I've heard in Hebrew, is a really awkward, incomplete sentence. Where I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I've heard that in English it reads perfectly normal, but from what I heard in Hebrew, it ends and it's like in English it gets translated and let them go up, and then the English translators like add something to the end to make it a complete sentence. But apparently in Hebrew it's like, and let them go up, and then it ends, and then the Tanakh ends. Do you know anything about that?
I'm afraid that's not something I'm familiar with. I can't speak to at this point.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, you should. Yeah. Okay, cool. So, do you have any more examples before we move on maybe to a different topic, or do you
Yeah,
have?
actually, a couple other word plays, if you
Okay.
don't mind. And these are a little more meaningful. The Micah passage is just kind of fun to catch all
Okay.
the connections that he made. But there's one in Jeremiah and one in Isaiah that are actually really important for us to understand. The one in Jeremiah is chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. And this, if you read it in English, says, "The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree," I replied. And the Lord said to me, "You have seen correctly, for I'm watching to see that my word is fulfilled." And if you read it in English, you're going, huh, that's interesting. What does the almond tree have to do with anything? And why does God said, yeah, you saw correctly, and then goes on and doesn't even talk about almonds? Well, it's another word play where the word for almond, which is shaked, sounds like the Hebrew word for watching, which is shoked. And so just that change of vowel um, brings in the wordplay, but it's completely lost in English because, of course, almond does not sound at all like watching in
Mm-hmm.
English, but in Hebrew they're very close. And so that's one. And if you have a good translation, it will footnote some of these to help you understand, oh, that's what's going on there. Otherwise, it's kind of seems kind of silly. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make any sense. Um, Another, though, is a double entendre in the servant song in Isaiah 53. In NIV, Isaiah 53:5 reads, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities." And the word for pierced there in Hebrew is micholal, excuse me. Um, and that's a valid translation for to be pierced for that word. However, there's a more common meaning for that word, a more common homonym for that root, and that's to be polluted or to be defiled. And you see, it's not uncommon in Hebrew, along with the word plays, they like to do sometimes this double entendre where they mean both things. And a
Mm-hmm.
translator can only choose one to put in. And I think the translators did just fine in choosing pierced because of the parallelism with the next line where it says crushed for our iniquities. The pierced and the crushed are parallel, and I think that's appropriate. But to hear in the background this idea of polluted or defiled, um, it's like they intended you to hear both, even though you can only translate one. And if
Mm-hmm.
we carry that further into the New Testament, where this is understood to be representing Jesus, to not just be pierced, which he was on the cross, but that he was polluted and defiled, like he carried our sin. It's just really important and theologically significant to understand that that was written into Isaiah as well.
Yeah. Wow. So, do you have a suggestion then, or do you know what the best English translation you think is that can like bring some of these things in? Of course, it's not going to give you the full picture ever, but is there
Right.
one that tries to do
Right.
really well at keeping some of these pieces of rhetoric? Or
I tend towards the NRSV. I know it's not as common, but I
hmm.
feel like they bring, especially verbal sequences, into English pretty well, which is something that is foreign to English. We use then or so to talk about verbal sequences. Or to communicate a verbal sequence where somebody does something and then they do something the next thing. But in Hebrew, that's all incorporated into the verbal form itself.
Hmm.
And so if you go very, very literally, you're going to come up with, and he did this, and he did that, and they did this, and they and those ands connected to the verbal forms actually often indicate more of a sequence. He did this, and then he did this,
Yeah.
and then he did that. And so I think the NRSV does a good job with that, bringing that to English. I'm happy with the ESV as well, although I haven't studied it as closely. So
Okay.
those are some of my go-tos. Although I grew up on NIV, so that's that's
Yeah.
always my default as well. So
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. What about, okay, so I know, because you had just mentioned the and this and the and that and the and that, because I know that in Greek, sometimes within the Pauline epistles, there will be things where, like, in the original Greek, Paul will write, what for us is like 20 to 30 verses. and it will be one sentence. Is that the same in Hebrew?
Yes, very
Okay.
often. If you run into an and, you're usually and plus verb, you're usually starting a new sentence and
Mm-hmm.
we'll usually put a period there. But if you went really literally, yes, it would just be and this, and this, and this,
Mm-hmm.
and this, and just
So they
keep
weren't
on
that
going.
big on, like, punctuation wasn't something that they used frequently?
No,
Okay.
no.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I won't stop you then if you have more examples. Just keep going and let me know when you're done because I'm
Okay,
loving these.
okay. I have a few examples related to artistry in terms of just the way they bring these ideas and put them into language. One of them that we get in the Hebrew Bible is what they call style switching or code switching, where they'll actually switch into Aramaic or another language to indicate this is a foreigner speaking. Okay, so an obvious example is in Genesis 31:47, where Laban and Jacob has fled, Laban has caught up with them, and they've made this covenant that they're going to not bother each other. They put up a heap of stones, and it says Laban called it Yegar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Galid. Well, Laban is speaking Aramaic and naming the place, and Jacob is naming it in Hebrew. And both of them are saying this is a witness heap. Okay, they're just using their own native language to communicate that. So that's obvious. But if you widen that out to the rest of Genesis 31, you're going to see a lot of vocabulary that's very common in Aramaic, but not so common in Hebrew, to give this a coloring, a foreign flavor, as well as some unusual syntax and constructions and so on, to let you know you're interacting with a foreigner, that is Laban, who speaks Aramaic. Um, Genesis 24 is another example where there are a number of Aramaisms as Abraham's servant travels to Aramaic speaking land to find a wife for Isaac. And so you get a lot of Aramaic words in there that kind of color that narrative to make it sound foreign. And the point is to give it that foreign flavor. It's like having a Mexican character show up in an English story, and he shows up and says, "Hola, my name is Jose." To say, "Oh yeah, he's a foreigner." That's how he speaks. But that gets lost because it all turns into English when you bring it when you translate it. Another example, and this is more artistry, is in Genesis 37:30, where Joseph's brothers have thrown him into a pit. Reuben has left. The brothers sell Joseph, and when he comes back, he's mortified. He's horrified by what has happened, and as the oldest, he knows he's going to be the one held accountable to this. And in Hebrew, I'm going to read it in Hebrew. It's like he's so emotionally overcome he can't even speak right. So the Hebrew for this verse is Hayeled enenu, the boy is not, va'ani ana ani ba. And if you go really literally with that, the boy is not, and where I going? And the English just smooths it out. The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? But the Hebrew catches this like stuttering, emotive speech that Reuben is giving over what in the world has happened. We just lost our brother, and now we're all in trouble. Um, and so that's another example of this artistry that they use in the Hebrew, that again is not captured in English. And then we can also talk about poetry. You were asking earlier about rhyme and
Mm-hmm.
meter and that kind of thing. They don't use those things, but they will use like an acrostic where each line of the poem starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So there are 22 letters, 22 consonants in the
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew alphabet, and so like Psalm 119, the whole book of Lamentations, each chapter in Lamentations is either 22 verses or a multiple of 22 because they're each an acrostic poem for Lamentations. The Proverbs 31 woman is an acrostic poem. And it's not just a throwaway item, and it's not even just a mnemonic device, although I'm sure it contributes to helping with memory. But it's
Mm-hmm.
this idea that I have said everything there is to say from A to Z. I've covered
Mm-hmm.
this topic. And so that's a common poetic device that's used. Alliteration we've talked about. play on words, those kinds of things are the poetic kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's easy to say, oh, well, that's just a throwaway thing. It just, it may add to the beauty. Okay, I can get that. But, what I want is the meaning. Well, you can't divorce the meaning from the form, for
Mm-hmm.
one thing. But also, I think it speaks to God's character as one who is a God who loves order, who loves beauty, who has created beauty into the universe, including language. And the people who he has inspired to write the Bible are just making use of that and giving honor to him in the way they've chosen to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and with if we're talking about some of these different rhetorical devices, or the way that that the Hebrew Bible is composed, being a reflection of some of God's character, one we haven't talked about yet is irony, or even
Oh,
just like
right.
little bits of comedic relief. And one that I thought of while you were talking was at the very beginning of Jonah. It starts by saying, like, introducing you to, Jonah, son of Amittai. I think that's how you say his name, Amittai.
Mm-hmm.
And the meaning of those names, I guess, would be intrinsic to the Hebrew language. And from my understanding, what it means, Jonah's name means dove.
That's correct.
And and Amittai means like faithfulness, or so it would. I think literally it means that Jonah is, his name is Dove, son of faithfulness. And then you go on to read the rest of the narrative, and it's like, okay, that's clearly irony, because he's the opposite of a
Right,
dove and a peaceful
right.
creature, and like whatever that represents, and then a son of faithfulness because he's not a son of faithfulness. And
Mm-hmm.
so like things like that too, where
Right.
I think it communicates a bit of some humor.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's cool. So if you're out of examples, then for us, for right now, those are some of your key highlights. I wanted to ask you what I've heard before, that there, and I don't know if this is a myth or what, but I've heard that there's some type of numeric correlation between Hebrew letters or something like that, where you can, get numbers from the consonants. I don't. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, first of all, yes, they, rather than using Arabic numerals,
Mm-hmm.
what we were used to, the, one, two, they didn't have anything like that. Either you spell out the number word, so ONE for one, or whatever it would be, um, or you can use letters of the alphabet, and they still do that even in modern Hebrew, where the first letter of the alphabet is designated number one, the second
Mm.
letter is designated number two, and so on until you get to 10, and then you start moving in multiples of 10. So the 11th letter of the alphabet actually represents the number 20, and,
Mm.
and so on. Okay. But it's not really used in the Hebrew Bible. The number words are spelled out,
Okay.
and even like for modern Hebrew or medieval Hebrew, they would like use it for page numbers. So page one was an aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew Bible, and so on. I don't think they really intended it to be some hidden code or
Okay.
something like that. I think people have made it into something it really is.
Yeah. I've definitely seen several TikTok videos where people are like, saying, "Oh, well, this verse, if you add together this and you take this Hebrew word
Yeah.
and do that," like people get super deep into the conspiracies behind it, but there's probably not much validity to that, is what you're saying.
No, no, I would not go down that rabbit trail.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, well, I think everything you presented us so far, I mean, this is what I love. My hope long term is to be a Hebrew Bible scholar and know
Awesome.
Hebrew like the back of my hand, because this stuff's really cool to me. Like
Yeah.
it's just super compelling and interesting.
Yes.
Um, but what about for the person who's listening right now, who's like thinks that this stuff is really cool and they want to engage the Bible on a
Mhm.
more, I guess, yeah, on its original terms.
Mhm.
But maybe they don't find themselves like being able to learn Hebrew right now,
Mhm.
or yeah, they just feel like they work a full-time job or run a business or do this and that, but they're like, now they're a little discouraged because they're thinking, oh, like I'm going to miss everything that the Bible's trying to communicate if I only read it in English. What are your tips? Do you just think everybody should learn Hebrew, or like what's the solution to this?
Well, of course, I think everybody should learn Hebrew, but I recognize everybody has limitations in some
Mhm.
way or another. If you can learn Hebrew, by all means, and there's all kinds of online free resources out there for learning Hebrew. One that I would recommend that I think is a lot of fun and very accessible is Aleph with Beth. They have a set of YouTube videos, and they'll start you in at the very beginning. And they work you very gradually through it. They're a lot of fun. Kids love them. I mean, it's just really good and pedagogically sound. If you have 10 or 15 minutes a day, pop one of those up and work on Hebrew.
Mhm.
That's a great option. But if you can't, or you're like, I can't learn languages, and I know it's more difficult for some people than for others. There are a lot of good commentaries. There are Bible programs like Logos, or my preference is actually Accordance,
Mhm.
where you get the languages, and if you know a little bit, you can hover your mouse over the Hebrew word and it pops up with the English translation, like, oh, okay, there it is, and you can keep going. Or you can right click and you can get the whole dictionary definition for it. So that's a great option. Some but some really good commentaries. If you find a good commentary that really deals with the language itself, I think
Mhm.
that's going to serve you well. You're going to get the Bible scholars' um, knowledge on that particular passage and the words that are used there, and help untangle some of these difficulties for you.
Yeah. Yeah, or I mean, I guess also at the bare minimum, doing what listeners are doing right now, which is being really intentional about learning from people like yourself who have spent their entire life doing this.
Mm-hmm.
If you find yourself way too busy and you are like, I can never learn Hebrew, it's totally fine. But even just, being able to learn from people who do this and
Right.
who are really good at pointing those types of things out. At least for me, everything I mentioned on this podcast about things that I've heard, in the
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew or whatever. Like, I don't know anything about reading Hebrew or the language itself, not yet. But those are all things that I've just learned from hearing people like yourself, teach on certain nuances within the original language. So, yeah, yeah, that's helpful.
Right.
Cool. Well, do you have anything then as we come to a close? Is there any final remarks of things like that you wanted to point out for listeners, or just anything else before we go?
Um, One other thing, and I'm going to plug my husband here on this in
Okay.
terms of Hebrew, and he does a lot of work with loan words, and this is getting back to knowing the language, and looking at how, because Israel was in contact with Egypt and with Assyria and with the Hittites and so on, they've borrowed in some words from those different languages. And some of the work that he's been doing is to figure out when those words were borrowed, because words, even in a native language, will change over time. And so, if Hebrew borrowed in this particular Egyptian word in this form, that it means it has to come from this period in Egyptian language development, which means that particular passage has to be dated to this particular time. Now, this is getting really deep, and if you're really into the languages and really into um, um, working through some of this stuff, but the payoff is we have a much more well defined way of dating some of these biblical texts,
Mhm.
working with the language and being able to recognize, oh, that's an Egyptian word. And if it's Egyptian, then it goes back to this place in Egyptian history, which means this passage from Exodus probably did come from, you know, the time of Ramses, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so being able to know the language, again, it just opens up these doors to more than just understanding the Bible, but understanding the context of the Bible, and so on. So, if you get a chance, I would say go for it. Like, learn the language. It's totally worth it.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for taking the time to teach us everything today. And yeah, thank you so much for just your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for what you're doing. I'm encouraged, and I hope you can continue presenting things for people to learn and grow in their understanding of God's word.
Yeah, thank you.